Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your joint flip classroom and our next and last unit, right? So our very last unit, Unit 11, being that mostly about World War II, right? So a big thing about it that we're going to be talking about, though, in this class as well is the interwar years leading into World War II. Because in our last flip, what we just finally did was we kind of brought an end and a closed World War I, right? We talked about the Treaty of Versailles. We talked about the 14 points. We talked about the rejection of the 14 points and the induction of the Treaty of Versailles, and how literally that was just a very, very bad idea, and how this is going to help basically handily lead to yet another world war, right? And then starting off in class, the big thing that we've been talking about is this whole different categorization for the 1920s, right? We're talking about how, like, some people in Europe may have referred to the 1920s as the age of anxiety, while others in, like, places like America, London, and Paris might have been calling it the roaring 20s, right? And so the first thing that we focused on was that roaring 20s aspect, and we'll get to the age of anxiety aspect here in this flip as well, because we'll talk about how things were just really not going well for a lot of these places and a lot of these different countries. And so the thing about it, though, is that we were talking about, like, the ideas of the cultural shifts of the 1920s. We're talking about the rise of the consumer economy, talking about the new woman, right? The new woman being the new image of the woman who can vote, she can smoke in public, she can work, she can spend her own money. The new and independent woman that is on the rise in the 1920s, right? So the thing about it that we're also looking at is we're also looking at a birth of new media and art forms, right? So big things we're seeing on the rise now as well in the 1920s, especially during the Roaring 20s, is the rise of things like the cinema, right? The cinema being a massive leap forward during the 1920s is going to take in a huge amount of growth with larger theaters being created, and then also just a lot more clientele and many more tickets being sold. And some of the earliest movies that were actually made during this time period, well, first of all, they were all actually silent, right? They were silent films and stuff like that. Talking movies and audio-based movies don't really kind of come out until about the 1930s, late 1920s. But some of the biggest ones include this one right here, which was actually a horror movie called Nosferatu, which is actually a silent movie about Dracula, which actually still kind of holds its credit. It's still pretty creepy. And then, of course, the very, very famous tramp himself. That is not who you think it might be because of the mustache. That is actually Charlie Chaplin, right? Charlie Chaplin actually made that mustache very, very popular and stuff like that. It's called a push broom mustache. And so it was actually kind of just a normal thing that was out there in the 1920s and 30s. But Charlie Chaplin was a comedic actor and a former circus performer who actually is going to become a silent film star. And he was probably the biggest star of the 1920s, and most of his silent films being like City Lights, Modern Times, The Circus, The Tramp, like all those really, really great like movies that he was in. And I've actually seen several of them, and they're really good. They're actually really, really good. So like now the thing about it though as well is you also had the radio, right? The radio could now broadcast into the homes of individuals, and news updates could be heard. Information is being carried faster. Now this is going to become a very kind of positive thing in some notes because we can now know about what's going on much sooner, but then also it's going to be kind of a negative thing in some notes because when we see the rise of fascist dictators like Adolf Hitler, you're going to see him actually give radios to most of the people in Germany so they can hear him very easily, right? And so his ideas can proliferate much faster. So the radio, though, is going to be a really big thing because what would actually happen is during the 1920s, families would literally crowd around the radio and hang out and listen to programs. Kind of like the way people listen to podcasts now, right? So then going forward as well, you're going to see a very different change up in art, right? So something that you need to understand about the 1920s is that it's coming after World War I. And art before World War I is a lot of art you've seen before. Y'all seen Van Gogh's Starry Night. That's post-impressionism. If you've seen Monet's Water Lilies, which are in the back of my room, that's pre-World War I. Those pieces still had color and life and elements of happiness to them and stuff like that. Well, art after World War I is going to take a very dramatic shift, right? We're going to see the growth of things like Dadaism, and we're also going to see the growth of things like Surrealism, right? Now, Dadaism being one of the more stranger of the two, Dadaism literally could be just about anything. Collages. This right here is the most famous Dada piece. It's called The Fountain by R. Mutt. And literally, when this was actually made after World War I, all that is, it's not a fountain. It's a urinal that's turned upside down. And so it's very, very, very like strange and very off the wall because basically World War I has just broken the psyche for most of Europe and also for most of the world. And then, of course, like Salvador Dali being famous for his surrealist style is going to make a massive, massive leap forward during the post-World War I era as well. well. Most of Dali's stuff actually existed in kind of a dreamlike state where things were kind of being contorted and twisted and changed and really aggressively moved. And of course, you know that this one is hanging in my classroom. This one's Geopoliticus and Child. It's actually a political allegory as well, because the man right here is emerging from this egg-shaped world, but he's actually coming out of the United States of America, because after World War I, because like if you literally look, Europe has been destroyed by World War I, Africa has been disfigured, and most of the world is actually bleeding from the outside, but America is emerging as a strong figure following World War I due to their booming economy and the growth in their actual geopolitical situation. So the thing about it though with art is that we can see the transition of art, and so the art does a really, really big thing for us. The art demonstrates that there's some sketchy stuff going on in the background, right? Not sketchy stuff in the sense of like negative things, but the thing about it is like, is all this Roaring Twenties stuff hiding something? And we'll get to that here in about 2 seconds. But by the way, just so you know, none of this stuff is going to make sense if I'm muted whatsoever. So go ahead and just throwing this out there that this is a subtle warning. A lot of y'all need to do well on this last test, right? But another big thing that's going to be happening is why? Why, you might ask yourself, is the Roaring Twenties economy doing so well? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that factories are becoming much more efficient, right? The economy of many nations, not really Germany, we'll get to that later, is exploding during the 1920s because of assembly line production, the 5-day work week, and the creation of leisure time on the weekends, right? Now, for those of you who have never heard of the assembly line before, the assembly line was a basic structure that Henry Ford and some of his other partners and other early businesses created, where literally a small track would move by carrying the product itself, and then as it moved by, workers had individual tasks to attach a certain thing, or drill in a certain bolt, or put this part on this item, and then it would just kind of keep on moving, and the next one would come up, and you do that same job over and over and over and over again. And so what's happening is like companies are realizing there are more efficient ways to build products rather than building them in large factory machines. If you want literally like be able to put it together a piece at a time, this right here is a Model T Ford that's coming off the line. I believe that's in the Manchester factory. And then the 5-day work week is going to come around as well, where people are going to primarily work from Monday through Friday or some semblance of 5 days during the week, giving them time for leisure on the weekends, where they can go to the beach and actually hang out with their friends and family, or they can go and join a sports club or something like that. This right here being actually the Harvard football team from the 1920s. Or during the 1920s, maybe they can go out and hang out. This right here is a picture from a speakeasy, right? Of course, our stereotypical flappers being right there with the gentleman who's probably taking them out on the town, going to an illegal alcohol cellar somewhere, because at the time, as we know, prohibition was big in the United States and alcohol was made illegal. But technology and factories are going to make everything so much more efficient that employment is going to be at a very, very all-time high in the 1920s during in places like the United States, London, areas of England and stuff like that weren't dramatically affected by the war. And the 5-day work week is going to actually give people consistent employment that gives them enough money and funds for that leisure time, right? Now, just like we were saying a second ago, though, with the art is kind of demonstrating to us with its change and its aggressiveness and all that stuff, that is there some sketchy stuff going on in the background that we need to talk about? Well, yes, there is actually. And a lot of people always ask me, all right, Mr. Terry, you teach history, you're a historian. Do you wish that you could live in a different time? If I gave you a time machine and you could go back to any time and live there, which one would you go to? Y'all, I'd go to now, okay? Now is the best time. Now is the best time because we're the most advanced. We are realizing a lot of our mistakes. And a big thing about realizing a lot of your mistakes is acknowledging the fact that the past wasn't always that great, right? Just because speakeasies were awesome and jazz music was cool and literally like the radio and the cinema and guys used to get dressed up and open the car door for women and they used to literally wear suits and go dancing and stuff like that on dates, doesn't mean that there's still not like sketchy stuff, because the Roaring Twenties was not roaring for everybody, all right? Because there were still massive lingering issues, right? In all those pictures, the people of those races are white, right? Like so, because still during this time period, the areas of the United States, London, places like that in Western Europe were heavily segregated, right? And also you're seeing a massive rise of anti-Semitism, racism, violence against minorities. For example, a huge thing that was going on in the South were these things known as lynch mobs during the 1920s and like the 19-teens, where literally Townspeople were acting as judge, jury, and executioner and putting people to death using them in or literally hanging them by their necks from trees, right? And then also going into it as well, you have to understand that eugenics is on the rise. Now, what eugenics is literally a scientific study, a pseudoscience. The word pseudo means fake because it is a fake science. It is not real nor based in fact whatsoever. But eugenics was a pseudoscience that popped up during the 1920s that aimed at creating genetically superior races by excluding people that they considered to be inferior. So they would literally measure your head, or like if they would look at some of your descendants, or if you had any degenerative diseases, or if you had autism in your family or anything like that, they would literally have forced sterilization campaigns. All right, so like where literally they would force onto people like saltpeter to make it so they could not have kids anymore, right? Trying to take them out of the gene pool. In California alone, over 100,000 people were sterilized during the eugenics movement that popped up during the 1920s. Later, also the Holocaust and the exclusion of Jewish populations in Europe is going to directly grow out of the eugenics theory of ideas and also out of the racist tendencies that had been going on at the time. And then also there was evidence to support extremely racist activity coming from this eugenic idea. But the thing about it, y'all, is it's not a real science. It was completely fake. And then another thing about it as well is that you have to understand that in the 1920s in the United States of America, there was massive amounts of race-based violence going on. This right here is actually a picture of the 1921 Tulsa race riot, which actually happened because they a white lynch mob was trying to catch a man who had literally tripped coming out, a black man that had tripped coming out of an elevator and just grabbed a woman's arm so he didn't fall. And then literally she said that he assaulted him. And then literally a lynch mob showed up and tried to kill him, but then when they couldn't get to him because he was in lockup in the county jail, they literally went to the prosperous middle-class Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and burned the entire thing to the ground because that's where that man lived, right? Like, so now that right there happened about 100 years ago, right? And the Tulsa race riot is something that not a lot of people talk about. We're going to actually skip over this. You don't have to look at that. So now look, biggest thing about it though as well is on top of all this stuff going on that's really sketchy in the background, the growth of eugenics, growth of anti-Semitism, racist violence, lynching happening in the United States, there's also some other real intense casualties of World War I, including the World War I veterans, right? By the way, a casualty, just so you know, is a person killed or injured in a war or by accident, right? So World War I veterans were heavily destroyed by World War I, both mentally and physically, because you had 23 million injured veterans coming back who suffered some type of disfigurement, right? And men that were suffering this kind of disfigurement did not have the ability to enter into those factories or participate in the ideas that were being referred to as the Roaring Twenties. Men had lost their sight. Men had lost their limbs. And another big one as well is that many men were suffering now from what's known as PTSD, or at the time they referred to it as shell shock, right? They called it shell shock because literally any loud bang or noise could send them back into terrible images of the war because of the artillery shell explosions that they were bombarded by constantly. Now, 23 million injured veterans are going to be coming back. Shell shock is actually creating massive problems inside the economy as well. But just to give you a heads up, there's always one person I like to talk about because there were people out there that were trying to do the right thing and trying to do positive by these veterans in general. And one of them is a very, very cool woman known as Anna Coleman Ladd. And why do I talk about Anna Coleman Ladd? Because she is a female individual that represents the plight of the veterans coming off of World War I. So she serves as a great representation of this because she literally would create prosthesis for World War I veterans. This man right here had actually been injured in an artillery blast, and it had carved up and destroyed a large part of his face, right? So she developed for him a mask that he could wear out in public and actually colored it and literally painted it to match his skin tone, and even kept it open so he could smoke a cigarette out of it if he wanted to, so he could continue to exist in regular everyday society. Why do I like to talk about Anna Coleman Ladd every year? I like to talk about her because, like I said, she represents the plight of those veterans, and I think she really represents the plight of veterans in the 1920s, and also can continue to represent them now as well. And it also is very important to understand that what veterans of a war are a very, very serious thing, and they need need to be actually taken care of. And so the thing about it is you have people like historically like Anna Coleman Ladd that do this. She represents the issue of veterans coming off of World War I. But many of these veterans, even with the help of people like Anna Coleman Ladd, are not going to be able to re-enter post-industrial economies because they couldn't. And women are going to begin to replace them, right? So women will actually, some of them will be actually more likely to keep their jobs in factories that they actually took on while World War I was going on. And so this economy is booming without them. And this is a terrible aspect of war's true tragedies and war's true violence because these men are being left behind. Now, this is going to lead to another big problem in some other areas as well called like fractured masculinity. But the other big thing that you need to understand about it is these booming economies, these crazy big things going on, all this art going forward, all this stuff, it's only really valid if you're one of the big three countries. And that's Britain, France, and America, right? The rest of the world, or not the world, the rest of Europe is going through the age of anxiety, right? Because if you're not one of these three guys, you're really, really struggling. If you lost World War I, or if you were not one of its biggest winners, the worst being Italy and Germany, you were having massive problems in your country. Huge problems that include hyperinflation, which was a really, really big one. High unemployment, failing business, fractured masculinity, your savings being destroyed. The biggest one out of all of them that you need to highlight, the biggest two, is hyperinflation and high unemployment. High unemployment doesn't need a lot of description. It's pretty self-explanatory. But hyperinflation is a thing that was going on in Germany as of 1923, okay? So in 1923, Germany is going to begin to default on its loan payments back to the Allies. This right here, these are children playing with stacks of German money in the street because they were worth nothing. All right, so like you have to understand the German government, to try and make it so they could pay back all these war reparations, are going to start printing money like crazy. And as y'all know, if there's too much money available in the economy, it causes inflation. And the inflation was so bad that a loaf of bread at one point in Germany went from costing 1 Deutschmark, which is one of these bills, to costing 2 million Deutschmarks, because that's how bad the hyperinflation was. This man right here is going to pay for a few items of food with a wheelbarrow of money, because that's how bad the hyperinflation was. This is going to lead to a rise of totalitarian dictators in these countries, right? Totalitarianism, what it is when a government is seeking total control over the lives of its citizens through the use of a centralized dictatorship, right? And you know of these people really well because we're going to talk about our fascist dictators like Hitler and Mussolini, and then we'll talk about our communist dictator and that of Joseph Stalin when we come back in class, okay? So do me a favor, go ahead and get this stuff that's on the screen right now, and then we'll talk about this stuff a little bit in class, and we'll go over it, and we'll talk to y'all soon.